Hey there. You wanted to compare Descartes and Husserl. Well, buckle up because that's exactly what we're about to do. We're diving deep into how these philosophical heavyweights tackled the question of reliable knowledge. You know, how we can be sure of anything at all.
It's a real head scratcher, isn't it? We're talking radical doubt, questioning the very nature of reality, and exploring the mysteries of consciousness
It's
itself.
a wild ride, that's for sure, but we're here to guide you through it. So, first up, we have René Descartes, the OG skeptic, famous for saying, I think, therefore I am. But before we get to that aha moment, we need to understand the intense doubt that led him there.
Imagine questioning absolutely everything you think you know. The sky is blue. Prove it. 2 plus 2 equals 4. How can you be certain? Descartes takes this kind of doubt to the extreme, like to the max.
Whoa, so he's basically playing philosophical prove it with the entire universe. That's hardcore.
Basically, yeah, he's saying we need to strip away all our assumptions, everything we take for granted, and see if there's anything left standing, anything we can be absolutely certain of.
Okay, so it's like he's demolishing a building down to the foundation, hoping to find some bedrock to rebuild on.
Exactly. And that bedrock, that unshakable truth, is his famous cogito, I think, therefore I am.
Right, because even in the act of doubting, he realizes he's a thinking being, something that can doubt in the first place.
Oh,
Pretty clever.
no.
But how does he go from this one little truth to a whole system of knowledge?
Well, it's not so little when you think about it. It's a starting point. From this foundation of I think, therefore I am, Descartes attempts to rebuild our understanding of the world, piece by piece, using only logic and reason. He's trying to create a system of knowledge that is absolutely certain, free from any shaky assumptions.
So he's like a philosophical architect, carefully laying a foundation before constructing his grand intellectual building.
Yeah.
But wasn't there a catch? Didn't this whole I think, therefore I am thing lead him to some pretty interesting ideas about the mind and body?
You're exactly right. It led him to mind-body dualism. Basically, he concludes that the mind and the body are two separate and distinct substances.
So even though he's trying to connect our minds to the world, he ends up creating this divide between them.
You got it. And that's where Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, comes in. Husserl was super inspired by Descartes' quest for certainty, but he takes a bit of a detour.
Okay, before we get to Husserl, can you give us a quick rundown of phenomenology? In a nutshell.
Sure, phenomenology is basically the study of experience. It's about how things appear to our consciousness. Husserl wanted to understand the structures of experience itself to see how we made sense of the world.
Got it. So how does Husserl take what Descartes did and, do something different with it?
Well, Husserl comes up with this method he calls bracketing. It sounds really complicated, but it's actually pretty simple.
Bracketing. I don't know about that. That sounds like something you do in English class, not like real life.
It's a metaphor, really. Imagine putting brackets around the entire external world. Not saying it doesn't exist, but kind of suspending judgment about whether it exists in the way we normally assume it does.
Interesting. So we're not denying reality, we're just pressing pause
Yeah.
on all our assumptions about it, like hitting the reset button.
Precisely. And this is where it gets really interesting because it's very similar to what Descartes was doing with his method of doubt.
So they're both using this kind of reduction, but to different ends. It's like they both start with a blank canvas, but end up painting completely different pictures.
You've got it. They're both using the same tools, but for totally different construction projects. Descartes wants to rebuild our knowledge from scratch, while Husserl is more interested in the blueprints, the structure of experience itself.
So both are into reduction, but with different goals in mind.
Fascinating. And how do these different paths lead to their distinct views on consciousness?
That brings us to one of Husserl's most important ideas, intentionality. And this is where things really start to diverge from Descartes.
All right, we're back on track with Descartes and Husserl. Last time we were about to delve into Husserl's intentionality, which is where his ideas really branch off from Descartes, right? So what's the deal with intentionality? What did Husserl mean by that?
Well, it sounds a bit technical, but it's a pretty straightforward idea. Basically, intentionality means that consciousness is always pointing at something. It's not just this isolated thing happening in our heads. It's always directed outward, engaging with the world around us. So instead of our minds being these, self-contained bubbles, Husserl's saying our consciousness is always reaching out, connecting to something beyond itself.
Exactly. Every time you see something, hear a sound, smell something delicious, or even think a thought, your consciousness is making a connection with the world. It's about something.
That makes sense. Like right now, I'm focused on what you're saying, but I'm also aware of the traffic outside, the feeling of my chair. My consciousness is kind of juggling all these experiences at once.
And that's exactly it. That aboutness, that directedness of consciousness is what Husserl is getting at, is how we make sense of the world, how we understand our place in it. It's a pretty big departure from Descartes, don't you think?
Totally. It's like Descartes spent all this time building a bridge between the mind and world, and Husserl's over here saying, wait a minute, there was never a gap to bridge.
Huh. That's a great way to put it. They're coming at it from completely different angles. Descartes sees this fundamental separation between mind and matter, while Husserl's saying, no, they're totally intertwined, connected through these acts of consciousness.
So both thinkers are dealing with how our minds connect with the world, but their starting points lead to totally different conclusions.
Exactly. It's like they're working with different instruction manuals for the same piece of equipment, and that has a huge impact on how they understand the self.
Right. Speaking of the self, we talked about Descartes' cogito, that whole I think, therefore I am idea. Did Husserl have a similar concept? Like, even when we're bracketing the world, is there still some sense of self that remains?
Absolutely. Husserl called it the transcendental ego.
Transcendental ego. Okay, now we're getting to the really complex stuff.
It might sound intimidating, but it's actually pretty intuitive. See, both Descartes and Husserl recognize that there's a core sense of self that persists, even when we strip away all our assumptions and judgments about the world.
Okay, so they both agree on a core self, but I bet they understand it in totally different ways.
You're catching on quickly. For Descartes, the cogito, that thinking thing, is like a solid, unchanging foundation. It's the starting point for everything else. But Husserl sees the transcendental ego not as a fixed thing, but more like a process, a structure of consciousness itself. It's not an independent entity, but the condition that makes any experience possible.
So if Descartes' cogito is like a solo performer on stage, Husserl's transcendental ego is more like the entire production. The stage, the lights, the director, everything working together to make the show happen.
Now you're getting it. It's the difference between focusing on one element and understanding the whole interconnected system. And that little distinction has some pretty major implications for how they view knowledge, reality, even the meaning of life.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. So how do these different versions of the self play out in their philosophies? I guess we'll have to wait for part 3 for that. All right, philosophy fans, we're back. Time to wrap up our deep dive into the minds of Descartes and Husserl. Last time we were talking about different ways of understanding the self, the cogito versus the transcendental ego. I'm ready to see how these different ideas play out in their bigger philosophies.
Well, the implications are huge. We're talking about fundamentally different ways of understanding reality, knowledge, the whole shebang.
Okay, no pressure then. So what are the big takeaways? How did these different views of the self change how they saw the world?
Well, one major difference is how they approach the whole question of whether the external world even exists. Since Descartes sees this radical separation between the mind and the world, he has to go to great lengths to prove that the world outside our minds is actually real.
That seems like a lot of work.
Right.
I mean, most of us just assume the world is out there, right?
Exactly. But for Descartes, it's a real philosophical problem. He needs to establish a solid connection between our inner thoughts and this external reality. But Husserl, because he's all about intentionality, doesn't have this problem. For him, consciousness is already intertwined with the world, always reaching out to something beyond itself.
So it's not just that they're starting in different places. It's like they're playing entirely different games.
Yeah.
And how does this difference play out in their theories of knowledge?
Well, because Descartes sees this separation between mind and world, knowledge becomes all about building accurate representations of that external reality. It's like we're trying to create a perfect copy of the world inside our minds.
So for Descartes, knowledge is like taking a photograph of reality.
Exactly. But for Husserl, knowledge is much more active. It's not about passively copying the world, but about actively constructing meaning through our interactions with it.
So it's less about taking a picture and more about, I don't know, sculpting something new based on our experiences.
That's a great way to put it. And this difference has a big impact on how they understand what it means to be human. For Descartes, we're kind of stuck inside our heads trying to peek out at the world. But for Husserl, we're out there in the world, interacting with it, shaping it with our very consciousness.
It sounds like they're offering us two very different ways of being in the world. So, big picture, what can we take away from all of this? What's the lasting impact of this philosophical showdown?
I think both Descartes and Husserl, in their own ways, are reminding us that we shouldn't take the world for granted. We shouldn't just blindly accept things as they seem. We need to question our assumptions, examine our biases, and be critical of our own experiences.
So they're both encouraging us to be more aware, more present, more mindful of how our minds are shaping our realities.
Exactly. And when we understand that we're not just passive observers, but active participants in creating meaning, it gives us a whole new level of agency and responsibility.
It's empowering.
Yeah.
It means that we have the power to shape not only our understanding of the world, but also, maybe, the world itself. That's an incredible thought to end on. Big thanks to you, our expert extraordinaire, for guiding us through this philosophical labyrinth.
It's been my pleasure. It's always fun to dust off these big ideas and see how they still resonate today.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the minds of Descartes and Husserl. We hope you've come away with some new insights, maybe even a few more questions. Until next time, keep those minds curious.